Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here with us. This is Rochelle, Scout and Development Director at the National Bicycle Dealers Association. We are grateful once again to have Jay Townley with us to give us another update on the supply chain and what we can expect and what is going on currently. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them down, either the chat or the Q&A. And we will get to them at the end of the presentation. And we will make sure to get to as many questions as we can within the time that we have here. So with that, I will pass it over. Thanks for being here, Jay.
Oh, thank you very much, Rochelle. I appreciate it. This is the fourth in a four-part series. This is the spring 22 webinar. We started out back in the fall of 21. We thought when we put this 4 webinar series together that by now, the 19th of April 2022, we would be looking at the end of the supply chain nightmare, or at least be able to fix a date for it. As it turns out, as I'll explain, we've had a new major disruption in the supply chain, and now several other changes relative to the supply chain. And we're not quite sure when it's going to end. So it's possible we'll do a couple more webinars on this or a related topic as we move forward. As far as the agenda for today, this has all been resorted and relatively new material. We're going to start with February 24. Now, the last webinar was February 22nd. So 2 days later, we had another major disruption, which you're all aware of. That's had global ramifications to supply chains, amongst other things. We're going to look at COVID-19 and its variations. It has not gone away. And while it looks like some countries, including the United States, are moving toward endemic from pandemic, China certainly has not. And that creates the new risks in China at this point, or the base for it. And then we're going to return to those risks later in the presentation. We're going to look at inflation, which you can't avoid from the standpoint of the global supply chain, because it's built in at this point. Price increases and the cost of getting goods from our manufacturing centers into the United States, which is adding to the inflationary issue. We're going to look at the bicycle supply chain as it exists today, close to April 19th, actually from April 17th. And then what's happened with all of the factors in disruption and what is now being said globally, both politically as well as in the finance community, relative to globalization. And globalization in turn is the underpinnings of the supply chain for many industries, including the bicycle business. And that's led to discussion of nearshoring and reshoring. That is bringing bicycle manufacturing, amongst many other industries, back to or closer to the United States. Then we're going to take a look at demand, and that being the issue of consumer demand on the market and what's shifted and changed. And then, as Rochelle said, we'll have a Q&A session. Please put your questions in. If there are any questions that we don't get to, or you didn't get in time, or you think of after the webinar, please send them to Rochelle and she'll send them to me, and I'll do my best to answer them. We always have this pause as I try to get to the next level of being able to change slides, and technologically we've never quite gotten to an answer as to why this takes so long. I apologize for the delay. This is the longest it's taken for us to get this to work. There we go. So February 24th. This I took from Fast Company simply because the headline goes to how the newspapers across the world covered Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. the subhead is it's reportedly the greatest attack on a European state since World War II. Obviously extremely disruptive, but what came out of this immediately was how important the Ukraine is as a supply source for agricultural goods, food products, and then as it turns out, machine products, car parts, and we were building up to what was disclosed is a major disruption to supply chains, but also a major hit relative to energy costs and what that's rippled across the world and all the supply chains. Now, this came shortly thereafter. This is March 2nd. This is from a posting on a website in Portland, Oregon. An opinion: gas prices have spiked again and cycling could too. What came out of this disruption, first thing out of the box, was the opinion shared in the industry that there was going to be a return to what we saw in the 72, 73, 74 period when we had an oil embargo, and that gas prices going up, which is occurring in the market, as you all know, was going to lead to another bike boom or a continuation of the bike boom. Gas prices, now this is, I'm sure, mild compared to what you're seeing out in California or the Western states at this point, but March 13th, this was all over the publications and the news media. The war in the Ukraine, the issues associated with raising energy, the increasing energy costs, how that would impact the bicycle business became the front page news throughout the global bicycle business. And there was little thought about the impacts on what was occurring in the supply chain, although that caught up to us. March 13th, I thought this was classic. This is from NPR's news feed. The headline being "Surging gas line prices bring back memories of past energy wars." And this was from 1974. I'm going to guess in Oregon, Washington State, California. And of course, they point out the guy with the lawnmower in line with the cars. But yeah, we had an oil embargo, but you had different causality. You had different economic situations, or a different economic situation in the world at the time. And I don't think there's many people on the webinar like myself that were in the bike business, actively involved in the bike business when this occurred. So I saw it up front and personal relative to exactly what was going on here. And yes, there was a gas crisis. Yes, it was caused by a war. In this case, the Yom Kippur War between Israel and a number of Arab states. And the United States immediately came to Israel's assistance militarily, not with our troops, but much as we're doing now with equipment. And the Arab states, in turn, lashed out at the Western powers, including the United States, with an oil embargo. And of course, the oil dependency was much different. Then the Arab states, Saudi Arabia in particular, was the largest oil producer in the world. Last year and the year before, the United States was on the list of, and if not the number one oil producer, the number two oil producers. So that was a big shift in the demand side. Now, I find this fascinating. As you know, I like charts. This goes to the gas lines then and the war now. This is from March 10th. If you look down here where my cursor is, this is the OPEC oil embargo. And they're pointing out the 1973, 1975 recession. Remember, the last bicycle boom was 1971, 72, 73, 74 is when this oil embargo hit. Late 73, October 73 into 74. In 1975, the boom was over. The bicycle business dropped off from 1974 to 1975 by almost 50%, a 49% drop off in bicycle sales from 1974 to 75. Now, what this confusing chart shows is focus on this blue portion. This is a change in consumer price index. And so what they're pointing out is when the last oil embargo was, the 73-75 recession, and again, consumer price index out through the present. And below that is the change in nominal personal spending. So consumer spending, they point out, faltered the end of 1974, where my cursor is. Remember, the bicycle business from the bike boom of 71 to 74 dropped off. It sheared 50% in 1975. So consumer spending started to falter at the end of 1974. Go all the way over to the right, and you've got 2019, 2015 or 2019 over 2015. And then the drop here is 2020, 2020, 2021. And now we're seeing the drop going into 2022 in the change in nominal personal spending. But still, compared to the rest of this chart, look where it is at 11.8%. And looking at the rest of this chart, it's higher than any other point in sight going back through 1970. So the difference here is twofold. There is more income in consumers' hands. There are higher wages that go along with the higher energy cost. And there are other inflationary and economic issues, plus the fact that you've got the change in nominal personal spending is still high as we take a look at these charts, and against the change in the consumer price index, which is not as high as it was back when we had the last oil embargo and the last rise in gas prices that set off a sale of bicycles, or a surge in sales of bicycles in 1974 at the end of the bike boom that started in 71, 72. So I realize this is complex, but it gives you an idea that, yeah, there are differences between then and now. Now, I'm not going to prattle on with more charts about this other than to say the idea of rising gas prices and energy prices sparking another bike boom has not yet come to fruition. It could. And I'm not ruling it out totally, not saying it could not happen if the right combinations of factors were in place, but so far they're not falling in place for that result. One thing that did occur, I found fascinating. This is the Financial Times, a UK-based European financial reporting magazine and blog and newspaper. And this is a current headline from April 2nd. European bicycle groups put brakes on reshoring as energy prices bite. Remember, I said that the disruption, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, February 24, has caused ripples throughout the supply chains. And you'll see some of those as we move forward. Here's one of them. Now, this is Europe. It's not the United States, but there was a reshoring movement. And keep in mind, Europe has already got, in round numbers, 50 to 60% of its bicycle manufacturing or its bicycle sourcing is in Europe. Portugal being the latest place where there's a whole group of both European and Asian investment being made, and investors grouping into a bicycle valley. And they talk about carbon fiber frame manufacturing, about component manufacturing. The big players, Shimano, SRAM, Giant, all have assembly and/or manufacturing inside Europe at some point, most of them moving into the old Eastern Bloc, the old Comic-Con. But in any case, there was a movement prior to February 24 where there was more reshoring occurring. Now, part of this, as we'll touch on, is because the whole idea of shortening supply chains and supply lines in order to bring component supply and finished goods manufacturing and assembly closer to consumer markets, collapsing and making shorter and smaller and easier the supply chains, and doing that on multiple continents. So instead of one supply chain from Asia to Europe or from Asia to the United States, part of the concept is Asia to North America and to South America and to Europe. You get the idea. So that was all churning. February 24 hits, and the continent's companies ditch plans to switch production from Asia to nearer home as power costs soar. The Europeans have been hit harder than the United States. relative to power and power dependencies. So this is one of the ramifications that we've seen from the February 24 disruption, the invasion of the Ukraine. European bicycle groups that were about to nearshore and reshore have backed away from that. They're staying with agent sourcing. The ripple effect of that is production might have opened up in Asia for North America, and it will not now. I've only got one slide on COVID-19, but I want to make sure you're aware that we're still in the era of predictable unpredictability. This again, current from last week, I believe it's April 13th. You'll see is the date when this was pulled. COVID remains a public health emergency for now. What's occurred here is you've all read that the mask mandate for travel has been overturned by a federal judge down in Florida. That news just over the last couple of days. However, the Center for Disease Controls has also extended the public health emergency. Now, under our law, that means that some health services and some health benefits are at very low cost or no cost at all, because this is a public health emergency. That's been extended into June. When that tolls or lifts or goes away, is our costs will go up. Our health costs relative to COVID and COVID-related variations will go up. So there's also an inflationary issue that is coming relative to the COVID. But for now, it's still a public health emergency. According to the World Health Organization on a global basis and the Biden administration relative to the US. We are also moving into a time when American cities, American companies, Americans in general are moving toward endemic from pandemic, and where we still have high instances of the variants, we're still hoping that reaching out to and moving toward public events, public meetings, generally trying to get beyond the pandemic. Now, this takes us to the new and old risks in China, because COVID-19 in China is treated differently than it is in the United States and Europe. There's a zero tolerance. Why is that important? China was the source of 87% of all of the imported bicycles that came in and e-bikes that came into the United States last year. It was over 93%. And for various reasons that we've talked about, it's gone down to the high 80s. So the United States as a bicycle market is still dependent on imports, and that import dependency is dominated by bicycle products made in China. And the components that are made there feed the plants. So back in January, and we showed this slide in the last presentation, these are the major centers. The black ones are the high-risk COVID areas, the lighter color on the medium. Shenzhen, Hong Kong have gone through their lockdowns, coming out of it. Shanghai is currently in a lockdown, trying to decide what it's going to do. But this is the center for what is a great deal of controversy at this point over this policy. And that is the zero tolerance policy. The end result that we see in the bicycle business is the bulk of the congestion problems that were attributable to the West Coast ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are still there to a degree, as we'll discuss. But the primary problem in the supply chain for bicycles globally has shifted to China, where returning empty containers can't get in to the ports to get to the factories, and finished goods aren't being made or can't get out of the factories to the ports and from the ports into ships to the United States. So the congestion and the blockages shifted from North America and the United States ports. While there's still some issues there, it shifted primarily to mainland China. Now, you've all read about Shanghai. This is from Sunday, the 17th of April. Shanghai to resume some production, reports more than 24,000 new cases. The number of cases is, to me, irrelevant in the mix because of the zero tolerance policy. When a case is detected, China locks down the vicinity, if you will, in this case, a whole city, and the ports associated with it. But as of Sunday, and this is from the South China Morning Post, this is an English language publication that is to a great extent a mouthpiece for the People's Republic of China. So it tends to reflect the views of the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC in general. What this narrative says is Shanghai is on track to resume production at key manufacturing sites after a 16-day citywide lockdown, which has been pretty ugly, quite frankly. And succumbing to pressure, according to the South China Morning Post, China is succumbing to pressure from foreign diplomats, business groups, and multinational firms calling for an easing of anti-coronavirus control measures. Well, yes, what you've got here is Tesla, Volkswagen, Apple, I can go on, Apple, every major electronics and automobile manufacturer has got plants that have been shut down in the Shanghai area. This is affecting the chip business as well. But it's an indication of the shift and the ebbing and flowing of what can occur here. Now, relative to, the bicycle business, new and old risks in China, because of the COVID, container logistics jitters grow as China blocks more highways. This is from Lloyd's, who, as many of you are aware, is a big insurance broker in the trade. Provinces in East and Central China have started to shut highway exits and entries. I'm chuckling at this, but it really has huge ramifications, and have tightened scrutiny on the passage of truck drivers. What's happening here is Shanghai lockdown, and of course before that Shenzhen lockdown, but there's a network of highways in China that goes to other plants we depend on in the bike industry for finished goods and componentry. And what's occurring is the municipalities are saying, oh, people from Shanghai could be traveling here, get off at a rest stop or get off in our city, and could spread the disease. So therefore, the local authorities are taking it upon themselves to put roadblocks up. Now, what this is doing is causing, as it says, exacerbating congestion levels by stopping truck traffic in and out of Shanghai, and particularly getting it into other manufacturing centers throughout the country. Now, we've shown this before. This is a map of mainland China. This goes to the power shortage issue, where it still exists because China's got all these coal-fired plants, and in order to be more environmentally friendly, if you will, and also to cut down pollution, which is quite severe if you've been traveling in China at all, in and around the major cities. Now, this was more of an issue before the Olympics. It's less of an issue after the Olympics, but to the extent that when pollution goes up, we're still seeing power shortages. There's no lack of energy availability. It's the problem of coal being burned to the point where it causes more pollution. And then you got to take a break, shut down the plant, don't produce energy, you can't produce products. So all of these colored in provinces are where they've had reported curb power usage throughout the first of the year. And this may have changed and shifted a little bit. What we put in were the major centers for bicycle and bicycle component manufacturing. Up north, this is a municipality near Beijing. As we move down across the coast in the Shanghai area, down across all the coastal provinces, Taiwan is just across from Fujian province, right here where my cursor is. And this is Guangdong province. This is Hong Kong Harbor right here. So, you had a lockdown in this area, you had a lockdown up in this area. You've had power shortages throughout. Again, this is just part and parcel of the old risks relative to Chinese sourcing or sourcing bicycle product in China. And we've already looked at the new risks. They all exist. They are all here now. This is the major problem in the supply chain at this point, shifting from the United States, which is still an issue, but not as much of an issue as the source country, mainland China. Now, the Federal Reserve and the federal government did kind of an interesting thing here. Again, I love charts. I'm not sure how much this one's worth, but we showed it last time. It's worth looking at on an ongoing basis. This is the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index created by the Federal Reserve. And what the headline here states is global supply chain pressures remain high, but may have begun to moderate. Now, I find that interesting because what they're talking about is this little downturn. See where my cursor is on the far right, that little downturn here. But you can see this goes back to September 1997, chugs along. Here's the straight line at 0. So the average value in standard deviations gets into the COVID period, 2019. Now it came down pre-COVID. Part of this goes to an issue in the United States of importers, including bicycle importers, not bringing product in. You've heard this story before. The subchapter 301, punitive tariffs, went into force in 2018. And so all the industry, the bike industry in particular, were arguing with government in order to get exemptions or exceptions. 2019 was a year that can be looked at as an anomaly because many of the importers didn't bring in goods because they didn't want to incur the higher cost of the 25% punitive tariffs. They were waiting for the exemptions to kick in, which didn't happen until December of that year. So, of course, immediately after that, we had the COVID hitting in 2020. And so you had this pressure building up that we've talked about in these other webinars on the supply chain nightmare. Here's the COVID, and then here's the build back and that whole index working our way up to this present may have begun to moderate. But with a high supply chain pressure index, it's simply reflecting what we're seeing in the reality of the supply chain nightmare, all of the problems occurring. I think it's worth noting, though, that according to the Federal Reserve and these other federal agencies, they're starting to see the pressure being moderated or abating at this point. And this may be an early indicator. So let's move to inflation. Prices rose 8.5% in March compared to 2021, driven by energy costs. The two biggest contributors to inflation are energy costs, gasoline at the pump, and all other related energy costs, and food. If you took those two out of the equation and looked at all the other products, inflation is actually something below 3%. So the two big drivers are energy costs and food. March, 8.5%. And here's what it looks like. The strongest inflation surge in decades, according to the Washington Post, continues unabated. Consumer price index changes from a year earlier. And this goes all the way back to 1960. Good Lord. Goes through the 70s, the 80s. Look at these spikes. Shows where the recessions are. These nice little pink areas here, the shaded areas. 2010, we all remember that, sadly. And then we get to the COVID. And here's the price index change or the increase in inflationary cost, the consumer price index that we're looking at through March at 8.5%. Also, March was the fastest monthly inflation of the pandemic era. It's also been referred to, by the way, as the COVID economy, which I find interesting. The consumer price index changes from a month earlier, going back again, 2019 and 2020.
Jay, I believe we lost sound. Jay, can you hear me? We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There you are.
Yep, thank you. Sorry about that. So this is the supply chain as it exists. What I was saying was that except for direct to consumer, which goes from this OEM plant directly to the consumer in the United States, missing all or sidestepping all these steps, possibly going to a assembler, a mobile assembler, but in many cases direct to the consumer. I will add that one of the things you should be looking at for the participants in the webinar, both the brands, manufacturers, and dealers, is the de minimis rule. And the fact that we have in the Senate right now a piece of legislation that originated in the House of Representatives that would completely amend the de minimis rule so that plants in China cannot ship e-bikes directly into consumers in the United States with an FOB value at $800 or below, bypassing all duties, including the 301 sanctions and all taxes. And right now, that is what occurs. And the estimates for these low-cost e-bikes below the $800, fitting into the $800 FOB ceiling on the de minimis rule for products, the estimate from Ed Benjamin for how many products got in last year under the de minimis rule directly from plants in China or Asia to consumers for bicycles is between 200 and 250,000. And that is an unfair playing field. And those are primarily e-bikes. And so consequently, please pay attention when you're asked by the League of American Bicyclists or People for Bikes to get on board with trying to help the effort to get this de minimis rule changed and to get the legislation now pending in the Senate back into conference and passed by the Congress and signed by the president. So with this said, this is the supply chain from raw material, components, sub-assemblies, all moving into OEM plants, getting put on containers, being trucked to ports, being put on ships. Now, again, the biggest problems we see right now in the supply chain are here, where I'm circling with my cursor, on the Asian side, particularly China. They come into the US ports, they're offloaded, they go on to trucks, they go to fulfillment distribution warehouses or brand warehouses. That in turn is in some way, shape, or form shipped to the retailers, mass merchants, sporting goods stores, bike shops, and then in turn delivered to consumers to fulfill and meet consumer demand. That demand is forecast back and in turn put in the form of firm purchase orders. And so that has been affected, and we've said this many times, we believe it's still true, by the bullwhip effect. And that simply stated is the tendency where a retailer will order more than they think the consumer has demanded. The wholesaler brand will order more than they think the dealer has ordered because of the demand is building up, and it goes on through to the plants where inventory is built and builds up in components that are needed to manufacture what is the bullwhip effect, or a larger number of pieces than what the consumer originally ordered. So the bullwhip effect is from the handle of the bullwhip as it works its way out all the way through from customer to retailer to distributor to manufacturer. Now, I've shown this before, but this is a family owned. This is the woman that owns a running shoe shop, 2 stores in Connecticut. And it was written up in the New York Times because at the first of the year, because it was pointing out this article, the supply chain problems have many small retailers like this owner of this running shop gambling on hoarding. And they come right out and say it. We haven't said it in the bike industry, but hoarding. So some independent stores ordered in bulk well in advance. Sound familiar? And now are hoping they're able to sell what they have. Well, that has been the case since the last quarter, fourth quarter of 2020. 2021 going into 2022. It might have been resolved as an issue. Either they've got enough to meet a increased demand or not enough or too much by the end of the first quarter if it hadn't been for what happened February 24th, which is another disruption to the system. So now we're still waiting to see. So the bullwhip effect has led to small retailers gambling. And in turn, from the supply standpoint, supply chains, many still have shifted over from just in time or JIT to just in case, because JIT is not working well at all. If goods that you anticipated having to sell to consumers in the month of April are still on a ship or still trying to get on a ship and haven't been offloaded into a warehouse in the United States yet, they're not available to you as a retailer, are not available to the consumer, then JIT doesn't work. JIT being the whole principle of it arrives the day I need it, or it arrives the hour I need it. And of course, systems are not that sophisticated, but they tended to operate on the ability to get goods into the United States in just over a month. And so what's happened is, from just in time, the systems in the United States for the bike industry in many cases have gone to just in case, which is, let's have the inventory, let's pay for the inventory, let's have the inventory in our financial system, make sure our bank knows that's where we're using the money, let's build it up, put it in a warehouse, get extra warehouse space if we need to, in order to have what the consumer needs when they demand it. Well, here's what the director of the Massachusetts Institute of Technologies Center for Transportation and Logistics said about it. And he plugs his book here, and I picked it up as a part of the article. For now, companies are building inventories to meet strong consumer demand. True. Over-ordering of parts and finished goods is rife, and the impact is spreading through supply chains. This trend will halt when demand collapses, as it inevitably will, and companies will be saddled with bloated inventories. Now, this is a warning, may not be necessarily so for everybody in the bike business, but it's a consideration. It's stop and think about this. What occurred relative to the previous slides I showed you, where just in time is giving away to just in case, is the whole just in time strategy has been basically tossed out by a lot of people. And the concern is that you're tossing the baby out with the bathwater, because just in time has been the linchpin of many, many supply chains. This is automotive, the Toyota plant, but still the bicycle business has adopted the Toyota system of JIT. But it's not just components coming to the line when you need it that hour. It's all about quality control and statistical product quality control, so that you produce less bad product, more good product. This is the Deming Rule. Deming was famous in Japan before he ever became popular here in the United States, and they ever started to teach the Deming laws and rules in the United States. And I say the 80s, some folks that have listened to me say that, say, no, it was the 70s, doesn't matter. He was in Japan after the war, after World War II, and installing a system that not only said just in time for componentry, but also statistical process control for quality assurance, making sure that you produce more good stuff and less bad stuff that goes with the process. If that's getting thrown out with the same philosophy of controlling inventory, then that leads to a potentially big problem. And there probably should be a mixture of, let's have enough for the consumer, but let's make sure they're quality goods. So this is the same chart I showed earlier, but what's happened in our supply chain that has not changed since I started to show this to you is we have a definite buildup of component inventory at the OEM side, China, Taiwan, Vietnam. And there are reports of, and this is what they can get. They can't get everything to hoard or to bank up, but they're getting what they can. And reports are coming to us that some of the OEMs are looking at outside warehouse space. Some of the assemblers of componentry into sub-assemblies are looking for more warehouse space. There are more finished goods in transit as the end result, and we'll take a look at the timing of that. And there's more inventory building up in the United States in the fulfillment warehouses, at the manufacturers' brands, and at retail, all waiting for consumer demand. And the issue right now will be, we've just had Easter and Easter break. That'll continue on for several more weeks, and we can take a good look at what that means from the standpoint of how many goods were taken out of the inventory, consumed as retail sales, and what's the replenishment got to be, and are in fact we overstocked or aren't we? But the fact remains that we've got inventory building in these places. It is not uniform. Not everything is available at the same time. Not all goods are available full front in warehouses for retailers. Not all SKUs are available at retailers for consumers, but a growing number are across the board. Now, you've seen this before, but back pre-COVID, when I pushed the button, did my forecasts, made sure my vendors had their componentry, and said, all right, here's a firm purchase order. I normally had my goods from that time to the time it arrived in my warehouse of 40 to 45 days with variations. But this was a typical lead time, in transit lead time. This was taken April 10th, or it is from April 10th. And what this is from Flexport Research, shows two waves. One is the far east westbound traffic. And what this is the cargo ready date. This is the days in transit, if you will. Going back to March 19th, and then the other brighter line we got here is the Trans-Pacific eastbound, which is the one you want to look at. But my point is that right now, today, April 10th, the in-transit times, here's 110 days from the plant to the US destination. From 40 to 45, essentially it's coming down a little bit when you look at the far right, but that's 110 days. You got the green line over 120, because you remember the blockage and the problems of getting containers through is at the Chinese end now. Ports of Shanghai, ports of Shenzhen, the other ports that are associated with these lockdowns. But still, for the United States, you're over 100. And that in transit includes product. From the time it leaves the OEM, before it gets into the warehouse and is available to a retailer or in the retailer's warehouse, you've got over 100 days of in transit, all full of goods. Now we're going to go into nearshoring and reshoring, and we're going to look at the whole issue of what's changed relative to the way in which we look at the world. From the early 80s through 1990, the American bicycle industry embraced globalization. Globalization is an economic concept of using American know-how and knowledge to manufacture goods utilizing low-cost labor in a country like China or Taiwan or Vietnam or Cambodia. We know how to make it. We know the methodology. We go in and we train the workers who are eager, smart, well-educated, but work at very low wages. And therefore our cost of goods goes down. Schwinn did that in 1983 when we shut down domestic manufacturing in Chicago and moved all of our manufacturing, or 90% of it at that time, to Giant in Taiwan. That was before the plant in Mississippi was opened up, but that never got to be more than 10% of the production for the company. So now go to the present. BlackRock. BlackRock has got $10 trillion in assets under management, and this is the boss, Larry Fink. The BlackRock chief, Larry Fink, said on March 23rd, the Ukrainian war marks the end of globalization. Now, Larry Fink said in his letter to the 110 managers or so that report to him that run this $10 trillion asset block, that there are a lot of factors going on here, recession, all of the issues we've talked about, but the Ukrainian war was the tipping point. It marks the end, he says, of globalization. Larry Fink is listened to, but what Larry Fink and his movement had too quick here led to was March 29th. This is from the Wall Street Journal Logistics Report. A new world order for manufacturing and trade is emerging from the turmoil that has enveloped global supply chains. So you went from Larry Fink saying what has been discussed. I mean, he wasn't the only one or the first one, but he was the probably most prominent global figure in the finance world to say this is the end of globalization. And we got to move to something else. Now, the world order that they're talking about here and this change in manufacturing and trade is, as you'll see, condensing, moving everything in so the supply chains are shorter, so that you don't have to bring goods from the United States or Canada to make a car in China. You take the subcomponents and the component manufacturing, move it into China, and then do everything in China. So it's a shorter supply line. And you'll see why I'm referencing that as an example. Same thing goes for the United States, Europe, etc. So now you started to see shortly after Larry Fink's letter and the articles that were written, you got the logistics supply chain strategies talking about this change in the world global order. Supply chain strategies again, Wall Street Journal, March 28th. Volkswagen International Supply Chain Strategy is taking on a new look in the name of resilience. What this boils down to is if you traveled in China, and this had to be pointed out to me by my partners who traveled in China. If you travel in China and you hail a cab in Shanghai, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a Volkswagen. And this is true throughout the country. Volkswagen makes and sells a lot of cars in China. So what this particular supply chain strategies article points to, it discusses Volkswagen International shrinking its supply chains. They are moving to shorten their supply chains. And this talks about how for their Chinese plants, components that are made in Europe and or North America that are shipped now into China under the JIT system, are those component source plants are being moved into China. They're investing in building component plants closer to the assembly plants so that they have a shorter, more flexible supply chain that is less susceptible to what occurred February 24th relative to the disruptions in the Ukraine, which, by the way, shut down and curtailed greatly a lot of car component manufacturing, some of it for Volkswagen. So this is part of what's occurring here as we get into the whole about nearshoring, rearshoring. We've talked about it, it's been discussed. We touch on it. There are advocates within the bike industry. You've heard Bob Markovicius, Executive Vice President of Specialized, talk about it. He's a great advocate of it. I am too. But we also have said it's going to take time. And that's part of the issue. Where it can be done, it's being accelerated. Now, this is Katherine Tsai. It's Ambassador Tsai. She is the United States Special Trade Representative, the USTR. Brilliant woman. Her background is Harvard Law, top of class, and she also was chief counsel to the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee and also to the full committee before being appointed by the Biden administration and approved by the Senate in her current position. And what those of us that follow international trade have been waiting for is the Biden administration to finally come up with a trade policy. Because what they've been doing is negotiating and pushing with China and pushing back and forth on the Europeans and dealing with what they inherited from the previous administration. April 1st, the US trade chief outlines policy shift, citing Ukraine war and pandemic. Tsai said that traditional trade policy tools, including tariffs, are no longer sufficient. She also said that we have to start moving American goods back into America for manufacturing as American sourcing. Now, the American first approach has been said before, been talked about before. For the United States bicycle industry, the idea of getting the supply chain closer to the consumer makes eminent sense. But it's also extremely difficult, unlike what we're seeing in the automotive industry. The automotive industry, it's difficult and expensive, but doable. In the American bicycle business, we have no component sourcing and we have limited assembly in the United States, limited. There's nowhere near the capacity here. So we're talking about major investment. We're also talking about major use of technologies, which are yet to be discussed or employed. So you've got a movement now of let's talk about it. No, let's do it. The automobile industry, the electronics industry, the manufacturing of chips are all driving now to a change in globalization, not necessarily an end of it, but a change, a modification, and also a change in JIT, and trying to determine exactly what's going to occur relative to the changing of these supply chains. Will the bicycle industry supply chain change? It's being pushed at this point. We're seeing more and more initiatives for assembly and manufacturing in the United States. We'll be talking more about them, but so far we've seen nothing that would begin to approach what Europe has at 50% or more of the product being supplied domestically inside of the EU. And we see a supply chain that will continue to be buffeted by this turmoil. And demand is one of the reasons that we have to be very careful how this is approached going forward. Will the demand stay high? Will the demand be enough to reduce what is a lot of inventory being built up and bring us back to levels where the supply can begin to feed properly the supply chain in order to satisfy the consumer? This is from March 9th to start the demand discussion. Consumers are still spending. February sales rose 8.7%. April 6th from MasterCard. March sales grew 8.4%. This is April 6th. So quickly, the demand, which is on the right from consumers, so far has stayed. Now, this is an old chart, but it shows very nicely what occurred pre-COVID, the COVID, after COVID. Demand for goods soared in the United States, and it remains high, as we've noted, for February and March. The question is, will it continue? What occurred in that mix, this also is an old chart, but shows what occurred. All spending in the middle, spending on goods at the top, spending on services at the bottom. During the COVID, spending on services, restaurants, movies, entertainment venues dropped like a rock, and people started to buy stuff. And they've continued to buy stuff, not just uniformly, though. They're not buying everything. They're buying selected items. And inflation is beginning to have its toll. Part of what goes to the demand side and deals with not only the goods coming in the United States, but the cost. This is from January 12th, and I put it up here because it was a number of the day. The average price per 40-foot container back January 12 was $14,572. And at that time, we weren't sure if it would ever come down. It was a 16% increase from the previous week, 169% higher than the same week a year ago. Well, guess what? It started to come down. This is April 18th. The unprecedented surge in container shipping freight rates is waning. Various measures showed the strong pricing that helped fuel big, and this goes on to say, profits for the steamship and the cargo industry and the trucking industry are beginning to abate. Here's what this looks like. Your shipping rates on average, this is $10,000 per 40-foot container, January 2022 to April 2022 to the present, April 19th, when this chart was done, starts at somewhere between 9,250 and 9,500, peaks just under 9,750, has dropped in 4 months to an average below 8,000 and continues to go down. Trucking. Once you ship it over and a container goes into a warehouse, it goes onto a truck. Trucking starts downshifting April 14th. The trucking boom appears to be tapping the brakes. The strong freight demand that has delivered bumper earnings for truckers looks to be waning. The Wall Street Journal logistics report writes, as shipping demand falls more closely in line with the supply of trucks. Now that's the steepest change, they should say decline, from the past year and a half, over 18 months. What's occurring is the demand for trucks has dropped to near what the available pool of trucks is, as opposed to what it's been for the last year and a half, which is way, way more demand for trucks than there are trucks available on the road. So that pressure is coming off. This may be what that leading indicator we saw early on, which was the index produced by the Federal Reserve relative to the pressure on the supply chain, is beginning to show. Container rates are coming down. Truck rates are coming down. So this is from the Federated Truckers Association, from Avery Weiss, V-I-S-E, talking about the trucking market and this decline in demand for trucks. The idea that you can just sort of print money is over. You remember the windfalls we talked about relative to the profit from the shipping lines? Well, it appears that at least in the trucking industry, they're beginning to figure it out. Here's another quotable from the Wall Street Journal from April 1st. The outlook going forward is definitely not as rosy as it was. We're expecting growth to slow down and consumer spending to slow with it. This is from the Bank of America. So now we're back to this combination of issues. Is demand going to begin to back off now that we've gotten into the Easter weekend or through the Easter weekend? If we get through the month of April into May, will the demand be down, and will we have sufficient inventory to serve the consumer demand, or more inventory than we need to serve what is the consumer demand at that time? I'm just about wrapped up here. I've got 3 more final comments, believe it or not. So we can get 2 questions, and we should have time for just a few. Dock workers, we know that we've got a contract up. West Coast dock workers, employers will get a deal this summer, according to the labor boss, the union boss. It appears that negotiations will start May 12 on a good footing, and that both sides are willing to talk and look like they want to do a deal and avoid a disruption based on a labor shortage, or a labor dispute. And this from Bike Europe, the giant chairperson, Bonnie Tu, expects prolonged supply chain problems. I would get this article. It's from April 15th. Please, if you haven't read it, read it. Bonnie is pretty straightforward. She is from the finance division at Giant. I worked with her when I was president of the Giant Bicycle USA. She's smart. She's a very effective chairperson, but she comes from a financial background, knows what she's talking about, and she feels that we're going to have prolonged supply chain disruptions and problems going well into the rest of this year. And it's based on a lot of what we've covered here, shifting around with problems in Asia as opposed to the US, bumping into the European situation, changes relative to how we look at the supply chain. Lastly, I would wrap up by saying, please, if you're a dealer, take a look at the dealer version of the NBDA Bicycle Buying Consumer Research Study. We find more and more references there that are extremely helpful to what's occurring relative to planning going forward. If you're a brand or a supplier, please look at the brand version at $5,000. The dealer side, or the dealer version of the report, by the way, is $399. You can look it up on the NBDA store on the website. So we've gone through these topics as quickly as we can. I apologize for the loss of sound, but I don't think we lost any content. And Rochelle, this takes us to questions if we have any.
We don't have any questions put in so far. If you do have questions, please type them in and we'll get to them. If anybody watching the recording has questions, please send them to info@nbda.com and we'll get them forwarded on and make sure we get your questions answered via email, or you can send them directly to Jay with his email on screen there. All right. So the question is, based on all of the information that you've given, what's the smart play for booking season this year?
For booking season, look carefully at what you can find out. If this is retailer, look carefully at your market, look at your inventory, be careful. I think the whole issue of booking is, if you're hearing on one side, you got to take it because I may not have it on the wholesale side, or you may not get it. I think you have to moderate that and be very careful to looking at what I presented. Don't hoard. Take a look at what you think the consumer demand is going to be in your market, and be very careful that you're not over inventory. If you're a supplier or brand, the problems that Bonnie 2 points out are the hoarding at the Asian side has gone to long lead times for a lot of brand componentry, because the plants have literally bought up more than they need, and they've stuffed it into their warehouses, and they're waiting for orders to come to consume it. So some of the lead times, I'm beginning to get the feel, I may be wrong, but I'm beginning to get the feel are artificial. So, if you come in and look at bookings and you can't get it, you got a long lead time, talk to the reps the reps from the brands very carefully, from the component supplier brands, and make sure you're getting your orders in place, but look at the contract terms relative to those orders, and hopefully you're able to negotiate clauses where you can shift around based on demand and or cancel. In summary, be careful.
Thank you, Jay. It looks like that's all the questions we have for today. Really, really great information. Hopefully we'll get more questions over email with people looking for more information, but thank you for being here. Thank you everybody else for being here and watching the presentation with us. Anything else, Jay? Closing?
Nope. I just, at this point, be careful. Be aware that unfortunately the supply chain nightmare is not over. It's going to change. It's going to change more dramatically because we now have more factors. You have more disruptions, possibly more on the horizon. Watch it closely. The NBDA will do everything it can to make sure you're kept apprised. Watch the trade publications, and be very mindful that we're in a turbulent time, and that at this point there's probably no return to what you would call a new normal or a normal, and just be vigilant.
Thank you. And with that, we will say goodbye.
Ciao.